Beneath the manicured lawns and oak-draped cemeteries of Charleston lies a story that was never meant to surface. A story that official records deny, that polite society erased, and that whispers of fear still carry through the humidity of the Carolina night. Imagine for a moment 9 of the most powerful men in Charleston society, the architects of wealth, the keepers of plantations, the arbiters of law and faith, each found dead within a span of 4 years. Not by disease, not by war, but by something far darker. Their families buried them with haste, their funerals marked by secrecy, and their deaths attributed to sudden paralysis, merciful, in the words of the physicians who signed their death notices. But what the city's elite dared not speak of was this. When renovations disturbed the soil decades later, when caskets were pried open, the bodies did not rest in peace. Fingernail scratches clawed the lids, jaws were frozen wide in silent screams. Their deaths had not been merciful. They had been entombed alive. And then there was the journal. Leather-bound, buried beneath the roots of Charleston's oldest magnolia. Words inked by a hand both precise and unrelenting. It bore a name. Solomon Fairfax. A slave, a healer, a man broken by the destruction of his family, and yet reborn as something the masters could never imagine. Patient, methodical, merciless. His writing begins with one line that is not just a confession, but a prophecy. Today, I watched my wife and children burn, and I did nothing to stop it. I am still alive. And I remember every face that laughed. From this moment forward, Charleston would not remain the same. Because Solomon, the man who once mended wounds, began to design a ritual of vengeance. 9 men for 9 graves, each chosen for their role in the destruction of his bloodline. And as you hear this story, you must understand, this is not merely about history. This is about power, about the systems that feed on the broken, about the ways suffering is buried beneath the whitewashed surface of wealth and respectability. The truth is simple. Those who believe themselves untouchable are often the most fragile of all. But let me warn you, once you begin this descent, you do not climb back out. Charleston in the mid-1800s was no ordinary city. To outsiders, it shimmered as the jewel of the South, a world of white-columned mansions, cobblestone streets, and the perfumed air of magnolias drifting from gardens designed to conceal the stench of human misery. To the powerful, Charleston was proof that aristocracy could be transplanted from Europe into the New World, fortified by slavery, ritual, and money. Rice and cotton flowed from the plantations into the city's ports, gold spilled into the coffers of merchants and planters, and beneath it all, blood watered the soil. The elite held themselves as untouchable. They wore their power like armor, their lineage like divine protection. They hosted grand balls where violins sang while slaves stood silent in the corners. They sat in pews on Sundays, their hands folded in prayer, their lips whispering hymns about salvation, while their wealth was built upon the sale of children, the burning of families, the breaking of bodies. Behind their civility lurked an arrogance that dared God himself to intervene, and into this theater of power stepped Solomon Fairfax. Tall, keen-eyed, and carrying the quiet dignity of a man who once healed both black and white, he became invisible in plain sight. To them he was property. To himself he was a vessel of something they could not see, memory sharpened into steel, grief transformed into a weapon. The masters saw only a skilled assistant, a slave with unexplainable knowledge of medicine and plants. What they missed was the silence of his gaze, the way he studied every face, every habit, every weakness. Solomon understood a truth they had forgotten. No system, no empire, no dynasty is invulnerable. All it takes is time, patience, and the will to strike at the right moment. His new master, Dr. Cornelius Hathaway, believed he had purchased a tool to elevate his practice, a slave who would make him indispensable to Charleston's wealthiest patients. What Hathaway could never suspect was that Solomon's mind had shifted into another order altogether. He was not merely preparing medicines, he was learning, he was cataloging, he was waiting. In the city's grand parlors, laughter and arrogance flowed like wine. Men bragged of fortunes made in human flesh, of profits counted in torn families. None of them could imagine that death was already seated at their table, silent, listening, patient. The man pouring their remedies, steadying their trembling hands, watching their every weakness, was already writing their epitaphs, and soon the ground itself would take them. Grief can crush a man. But sometimes grief becomes something far more dangerous. For Solomon, the breaking of his family was not just a personal tragedy, it was a revelation. He had spent his life saving others, binding wounds, easing fevers, pulling the sick back from the edge of death. And yet, when the fire consumed everything he loved, when his wife was left to bleed on the roadside, when his children were torn away into the maw of the slave markets, none of that knowledge mattered. His hands, once instruments of life, had been shackled. His voice, once trusted, had been silenced. His existence, once defined by healing, was reduced to nothing. It was in that nothingness that something new was born. Solomon realized the truth that the masters never wanted spoken aloud, that their power was not divine, not ordained, not eternal. It was fragile, built upon illusions, maintained by fear, and dependent on silence. And silence, he decided, was over. Each night, in the dim light of a single candle, Solomon began to write. His journal was no mere diary. It was a ledger of vengeance. Every entry was a wound reopened, every sentence a promise inked in the shadow of his loss. He wrote the names of men who laughed at the auction block. He recorded their boasts, their wealth, their habits. He dissected them as if they were patients on a table, not to cure, but to prepare for execution. His words became spells of memory, binding him to a mission that no man, no master, no god could strip from him. In the day, he remained the healer, gentle, quiet, precise. He measured compounds, assisted with surgeries, soothed the wealthy with his knowledge. To them, he was harmless. But inside, he studied a darker medicine. He had seen the texts in Dr. Hathaway's library, pages detailing plants and minerals that could paralyze, weaken, or mimic death itself. Most doctors dismissed these as curiosities, oddities from distant lands. Solomon saw something else. He saw a weapon that could turn arrogance into terror and power into helplessness. His grief no longer bent him to the earth. It sharpened him into something relentless. The man who had once begged for mercy was gone. In his place rose a figure who would show Charleston's elite that the graveyard does not respect wealth, and that silence, once broken, can become a scream loud enough to haunt centuries. The first name was already written. The first death was waiting. The world believes death comes suddenly, a thief in the night, a shadow that strikes without warning. But Solomon knew better. Death could be prepared, shaped, engineered, and in Charleston, under the watchful eyes of men who thought themselves immune to consequence, he began his education in the anatomy of terror. Dr. Hathaway's library was no ordinary collection of medical texts. It was the private vault of a physician fascinated by the exotic, manuals from Europe, treatises from South America, notes from explorers who had catalogued plants and venoms long before Charleston's polite society ever sipped tea in its parlors. To Hathaway, these were curiosities, symbols of prestige to impress patients. To Solomon, they were the raw ingredients of a new form of justice. Night after night, when the doctor's candles burned low, Solomon studied. He read of South American vines whose extracts left the body limp, the mind conscious. He learned of roots from Africa that induced paralysis, of minerals that slowed the heart until it seemed still. He discovered formulas that could make a man appear dead to all but the most trained physician, yet leave him screaming silently inside, aware of every nail driven into his coffin lid. But Solomon was not reckless. Revenge without discipline is suicide. He cultivated patience. He tested doses in secret, using small animals, measuring their tremors, their paralysis, their silence. He refined his compounds until he could predict the precise hour a victim's lungs would seize, the minute their heart would fail, the exact moment terror became irreversible. And it was not just the chemistry he mastered. Solomon studied his enemies as carefully as he did his poisons. He memorized their illnesses, their appetites, their vices. He learned which men drank too deeply, which trusted medicine more than prayer, which carried secret weaknesses beneath their polished exteriors. In every handshake, in every treatment he prepared, he saw not a patient, but a corpse in waiting. His journal thickened with details. Each man became a case study, his habits dissected, his arrogance documented. The journal's pages bore no pity, only observation, calculation, inevitability. In Charleston's grand homes, laughter still rang. The masters still boasted of fortunes and bloodlines. They toasted themselves as immortals. And all the while Solomon's shadow lengthened over them, unseen. The man they dismissed as property had become the architect of their extinction. For the first time since the ashes of his family cooled, Solomon smiled, not with joy, but with certainty. The graveyard was listening, and soon it would be fed. Every revolution begins with a single name. For Solomon, that name was Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick, a man whose wealth dripped from rice fields, whose arrogance filled Charleston's drawing rooms, and whose cruelty was as well known as the stench of the swampy plantations he owned. Fitzpatrick was not merely complicit in Solomon's destruction. He had been present the day his children were sold, and he had laughed, a booming, guttural laugh, as the bidding climbed. He had even remarked with casual vulgarity on the breeding potential of Solomon's young boys, reducing them to livestock before their father's eyes. That laugh, Solomon decided, would be buried beneath the soil with him. Fitzpatrick's body betrayed him long before Solomon's hand touched it. He suffered from chronic gout, his swollen feet and twisted joints dragging him regularly to Dr. Hathaway's office for relief. The colonel trusted medicine as a drunkard trusts the bottle, and he trusted Solomon most of all. The enslaved healer's touch was steady, his remedies reliable, and his silence absolute. Fitzpatrick had grown accustomed to seeing Solomon as a servant who smoothed his pain, never realizing that the hands applying his poultice were already writing his obituary. In the privacy of the journal, Solomon documented everything: Fitzpatrick's dosage schedules, his reliance on laudanum, the frequency of his attacks. He noted the colonel's habit of arriving without escort, preferring not to appear weak before other men of standing. It was a vulnerability Solomon underlined again and again. Alone, vulnerable, trusting. But more than the physiology, Solomon studied the psychology. He knew that true revenge was not simply killing, it was transformation. It was taking the very pillar of power and forcing him into a state of helplessness so complete that death became a mercy. And so Solomon did not plan for quick poison, nor an accident, nor a blade in the night. He prepared something far worse, a burial where the mind screamed as the body lay shackled in paralysis, each heartbeat hammering against the coffin's lid, each claw mark carved into wood a prayer that no god would answer. In the quiet of the night, Solomon rehearsed the act in his mind, not out of haste, but out of ritual. The preparation became sacred, the steps unbreakable. This was no murder. This was initiation. Fitzpatrick would be the first sacrifice, the first offering to the silence of the grave, and when the moment came, Solomon knew the soil of Charleston would drink the fear it had sown for centuries. The ritual of execution began with a smile. Fitzpatrick entered the clinic with the swagger of a man who owned the riverbank and believed himself beyond consequence. He joked with the doctor about the weather, about harvests, about the robustness of Charleston's social order. Solomon greeted him with the same measured calm he had shown for months, soft words, steady hands, the kind of deference that dissolves suspicion. The colonel did not notice the way Solomon's eyes paused on the calluses of his hands, or the way his fingers lingered on the vial before mixing it into the prescribed tonic. To Fitzpatrick, the remedy was routine. To Solomon, it was fate in liquid form. They spoke of small things while the procedure began. Horses, gout, the endless monotony of managing land. Fitzpatrick complained with petulant charm about his pain. Solomon applied poultices with the precision of a man who has practiced mercy his whole life. The colonel fell into the old habit of trusting the healer who never asked for anything. He lay back confident that a few doses would ease his suffering and perhaps allow him to boast at the next dinner about how medicine made the weak strong again. No one had taught him to fear the quiet man mounted on the fringe of his life. The change, when it came, was gradual to the room, but absolute to the patient. First, a coolness at the fingertips, a heaviness that crept up the limbs, then a silence in the breath that felt like sleep. To the attendants and the doctor it resembled an advanced collapse, an unfortunate culmination of gout and laudanum. To Solomon, it was the exact moment of triumph he had mapped in his journal. A body rendered inert while consciousness remained, a mind trapped behind a silent corpse. He watched the colonel's chest rise and fall with the small, obedient breaths of someone rendered hostage within their own flesh. The funeral way, says hurried, private, the procession small and solemn. Fitzpatrick's peers closed ranks, preferring confidentiality to scandal. They praised the doctor for his care and chalked the colonel's death up to natural causes, another casualty in a city where sickness often followed wealth. No one demanded an autopsy. No one asked questions about fingernail marks or the frozen expressions beneath the burial cloth. The coffin descended, and the elite returned to their parlors, untroubled, certain that their power had once again proven permanent. Only Solomon remembered the sounds that followed, the muffled, impossible scratches on wood, the tiny animal desperation that no one else would ever hear. He kept those sounds like prayers, like proof. Fitzpatrick's death became a seed. It was the first ripple of a storm that would strip away reputations, unravel families, and expose the rot beneath Charleston's polite veneer. And as the dirt settled, Solomon closed his journal, wrote the colonel's name once more, and prepared for the next man to be taught what it meant to be powerless. The burial of Colonel Fitzpatrick marked more than the death of one man. It was the ignition of a cycle that could not be reversed. For Solomon, it was not relief, it was confirmation. The silence of the grave had accepted its first offering, and now the path stretched forward like a corridor lit only by vengeance. One name had been crossed out in the journal, but 8 remained, glowing like embers waiting to be fanned into flame. Charleston, however, noticed nothing. In the parlors and drawing rooms, the colonel's death was treated as an inconvenience, a whisper rather than a scandal. Men toasted his memory with brandy. Women sighed about the fragility of even the strongest among them. No one suspected foul play. After all, death visited often in the South. Cholera, fevers, infections. One more plantation owner slipping into the earth raised no alarm. But to Solomon, it was astonishing how blind they were. They had been raised to believe their walls were impenetrable, their wealth a shield. They never saw the shadow inside their own households, never questioned the man who poured their medicine, who held their wrists, who leaned close enough to hear their final breath. With Fitzpatrick's name sealed in the soil, Solomon turned his attention to the next target, Judge Nathaniel Greaves. Greaves was no planter but a man of the law, whose decisions in Charleston's courts had shattered lives as cleanly as a gavel split silence. He had presided over the very sale that scattered Solomon's children. His judgment had dismissed Solomon's pleas as irrelevant, his voice cold as he read the legality of a system designed to sanctify cruelty. In his courtroom, Solomon's grief had been a footnote, drowned beneath the booming authority of law. For that, Greaves was marked. Unlike Fitzpatrick, the judge's health was stable. He did not limp into the clinic with swollen joints or seek medicine to ease the nights. Instead, his weakness was subtler. Pride, vanity, the desire to remain untouchable even in the face of aging. He trusted his reputation to shield him, trusted the rituals of power to preserve him. But Solomon had learned by now that every man has a flaw. Some are written in the body, others are etched into the soul, and so he began to study Greaves, not as a patient, but as a riddle. He learned the judge's habits, the foods he favored, the meetings he attended, the secret discomforts he tried to mask from the public eye. The journal thickened with notes, each page a thread tightening into a noose. 8 remained. Soon, 7. The descent was quickening, and Solomon's shadow stretched wider across Charleston's corridors of power. The judge was not a man who could be reached by blunt force. Solomon understood this immediately. Nathaniel Greaves was proud, meticulous, and armored by his own belief in the sanctity of law. Men like him did not fear death in the abstract. They believed themselves too rational, too disciplined, too powerful to be haunted by shadows. To break a man like Greaves required more than poison. It required dismantling the illusion of control he had built around himself brick by brick. Solomon watched him first in the clinic when Greaves came for routine consultations. The judge had no real ailments, only the vanity of age pressing at the edges of his confidence. He requested tonics to sharpen the mind, mixtures to steady the nerves, elixirs to maintain his vigor. He spoke of law and order as though they were divine absolutes, his voice carrying the weight of finality. But Solomon noted the small betrayals, the tremor in the judge's fingers when he signed papers, the shallow breath he took after climbing stairs, the way his eyes flicked with irritation at the smallest discomfort, weaknesses hidden beneath the mask of authority. It was here Solomon began to practice something new, not the chemistry of death, but the psychology of fear. He slipped small, undetectable doses into Greaves's tonics, not enough to kill, not even enough to sicken, just enough to introduce uncertainty. A flicker of dizziness during a court session, a sudden numbness in the hands while writing, a night of restless dreams interrupted by the sense of being watched. The symptoms came and went like whispers, subtle enough for the judge to dismiss, yet persistent enough to unsettle. In his journal, Solomon wrote, "The lawgiver must doubt his own body. Only then will he taste the helplessness he prescribed to others." Each day, Greaves grew more distracted, his decisions slower, his confidence thinner. He begged about dance, and to visit the clinic more often, searching for explanations, asking Solomon for adjustments, trusting him with the most intimate confessions of his weakness. This was the true poison, not the liquid in the vial, but the erosion of certainty. By the time Solomon prepared the real dose, the judge's mind would already be broken, his authority corroded. What terrified men most was not the coffin. It was the realization that the world could tilt beneath their feet, that power could dissolve without warning. The graveyard did not need to rush. Fear was the first burial, and Greaves was already sinking. The night chosen for Judge Nathaniel Greaves's undoing arrived without fanfare. To Charleston, it was another evening of lantern-lit carriages and polished silver in the parlors of the elite. To Solomon, it was a ritual, prepared with the same precision as a surgeon before the table. He had rehearsed every movement in silence, each step of the process practiced until it was less an action than an inevitability. Greaves came willingly, as Solomon knew he would. By now the judge's faith in his healer was absolute. Weeks of subtle manipulations had hollowed him into dependence. The dizziness, the numbness, the sleepless nights, he confided them all to Solomon, never suspecting the man taking his pulse was the very architect of his decline. The judge carried himself with the stiff dignity of law, but his eyes betrayed him, darting, uncertain, haunted by the creeping suspicion that his own body was betraying him. That night, Solomon offered him a new tonic, a stronger solution, he explained in his measured voice, to quiet the nerves, to restore clarity. Greaves drank without hesitation. Within the hour, the first effects took hold, a slackness in the limbs, a heaviness in the tongue, the growing terror of consciousness trapped in paralysis. He tried to speak, to demand explanation, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. Solomon stood over him, calm, deliberate, a shadow cut from the silence. "The law bound me in chains," Solomon murmured. His words meant only for the judge's failing ears. Now the law will learn chains of its own. The burial was carried out with the same cold efficiency as Fitzpatrick's. Another coffin, another silent descent beneath Charleston soil. But unlike the colonel, Judge Greaves had tasted weeks of uncertainty before his final interment. His coffin was not only a prison of wood and earth, it was the culmination of a psychological collapse engineered by Solomon's hand. As the first shovelfuls of dirt struck the lid, Greaves's mind, once certain of its supremacy, cracked fully under the weight of helplessness. Charleston, again, saw nothing. The obituary spoke of sudden complications. Lawyers and planters gathered to eulogize his dedication to order, his legacy as a man of law. No one heard the frantic scratching within the coffin. No one felt the panic that gnawed the judge alive in the earth. Only Solomon recorded it, etching the second name into his ledger with an almost ceremonial finality. Now 7 remained. And the city, still oblivious, was already living in the shadow of its own reckoning. Charleston prided itself on order, on polished streets and candlelit halls, on the rhythm of commerce and the rituals of law. Death was common, yes, fevers, infections, accidents, but it followed patterns the city understood. That was why the deaths of Colonel Fitzpatrick and Judge Greaves passed without true alarm. To the elite, they were tragedies of circumstance, the fragile cost of mortality. Yet in the corners of whispered conversation, something colder began to stir. 2 men of stature, gone within months of each other, both known for their vigor, both attended by the same household physician, both entrusted to the same healer. The coincidences were thin as glass, but glass breaks easily when pressure mounts. Servants gossiped in kitchens, their words laced with nervous suspicion. Dockworkers muttered of curses, of restless spirits taking vengeance for the unburied dead. And though the planters scoffed at superstition, even they lowered their voices when discussing it. Men of power despise nothing more than a pattern they cannot control, but Solomon was not rushing. He understood that true fear is not born in the coffin. It blossoms in the days before, when men start to sense an invisible hand guiding their fate. 2 names had been struck from his journal, but he let the others live in ignorance for now, savoring the way rumors crawled through Charleston like smoke. Fear, after all, was his greatest ally. It softened the ground before the grave was dug. The next name on his list was Reverend Josiah Tramble, a man who clothed his cruelty in scripture. From the pulpit, Tramble thundered sermons that sanctified bondage, declaring slavery a divine order. He had mocked Solomon's pleas the day his children were sold, raising his voice above the weeping to proclaim, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away." To him, suffering was obedience, pain was piety, and men like Solomon were never meant to rise from their knees, but Solomon had learned patience. For Tramble, the plan would not be quick. This would not be just another body lowered into the earth. It would be the slow unraveling of faith itself. The Reverend believed his God made him untouchable. Solomon would show him that even prophets could be buried alive. Charleston still slept, blind to the storm it had birthed. But in the silence of his candle-lit room, Solomon turned the page of his ledger and wrote a single line beneath the Reverend's name. "Your pulpit will be a coffin. Your scripture will be the sound of earth on wood." Reverend Josiah Tramble stood taller than most men, not in body but in certainty. His words were iron, his sermons fire. In Charleston, his voice was treated as scripture itself, each syllable reinforcing the chains of bondage as holy, each gesture of his hand painting slavery as divine order. To question Tramble was to question God, and so his cruelty wore the mask of righteousness, and his parishioners applauded as though every lash, every sail, every broken family was a hymn sung to heaven. But Solomon knew better. He had sat in the back of that church, forced to listen as Tramble thundered from the pulpit that his wife's death was God's will, that the selling of children was divinely ordained. Solomon remembered how the Reverend's voice carried over the weeping of mothers, how his hand pounded the Bible while families were torn apart in the marketplace. It was not God speaking in that church. It was power hiding behind scripture, and power, Solomon had learned, could be unmasked. He began with the Reverend's body. Though Tramble appeared strong, Solomon had observed him up close, at suppers, at visits to the doctor's house. The man's stomach was sour, prone to acid and pain. He often requested tonics for indigestion, and though he tried to mask it in public, he winced at certain foods, dabbed sweat from his brow after sermons. To Solomon, these were not ailments. They were doors waiting to be opened. The first doses were small, bitter herbs masked in powders, enough to upset, not enough to alarm. Tramble began to suffer strange dreams, sweats that drenched him at night, sudden waves of dizziness mid-sermon. His congregation noticed the pauses in his once booming voice, the stammer that crept into his once perfect cadence. To them it was nothing. To Solomon it was the beginning of doubt, but Solomon's strategy reached beyond the body. He attacked the Reverend's faith. Late at night, subtle acts unfolded. pages of scripture in Tramble's study warped with dampness, as though touched by unseen hands. A Bible left open would fall shut, only for the Reverend to discover it reopened to verses of judgment and wrath. Servants whispered of shadows in the rectory halls, of the sound of scratching when no rats could be found. None of this was chance. Solomon had learned the art of silence, the power of suggestion, the ways in which fear blossoms when a man believes his own God has turned against him. Soon, the Reverend began to falter not only in body but in spirit. He preached less of God's certainty and more of the devil's temptations. His eyes darted nervously in the pulpit, his voice trembled with unspoken dread. The congregation began to murmur. The man who had once stood as unshakable stone was cracking, and no scripture could seal the fractures. Solomon's ledger bore his name in ink, but beside it, a new word had been added: doubt. The coffin would come. But first the Reverend had to taste the very fear he had dismissed as weakness, a terror so complete it would strip the word faith from his lips before the earth claimed him. The night of Reverend Tramble's undoing arrived not with thunder, but with silence. A humid stillness pressed down upon Charleston, the air heavy with the scent of magnolia and the rot of marsh water. Solomon prepared his mixture with precision. Drops of a paralytic distilled into the Reverend's trusted stomach remedy, disguised beneath the bitter tang of peppermint oil. To the doctor, it was medicine. To Tramble, it was salvation. To Solomon, it was scripture rewritten in flesh. When the Reverend visited Hathaway's practice, his body was already trembling. His once commanding voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion. His sermon notes shook in his hands. The doctor dismissed it as nerves, perhaps exhaustion from the burden of shepherding souls. Solomon merely nodded, pouring the Reverend's tonic with hands steady as glass. The liquid touched Tramble's lips, and history shifted its course. Within an hour, the Reverend felt the weight. First, his stomach clenched, as though the earth itself pressed its palm against his gut. Then came the waves of paralysis, creeping up his arms like vines, tightening across his chest until breath came shallow and ragged. His mind remained awake, alive, frantic. He tried to cry out, but his tongue no longer obeyed. He collapsed, stiff as stone, eyes wide with terror. Dr. Hathaway declared it sudden seizure. "The Lord has chosen his servant," he intoned solemnly, as if pronouncing a benediction. But Solomon knew the truth. No lord had claimed him. Solomon had. The undertakers carried him quickly, for the city demanded swift burials in the heat of Carolina nights. A coffin was nailed shut before the morning bells. No embalming, no questions, just another clergyman fallen to God's mysterious design. But what no one heard, as the coffin descended into the earth, was the muffled scratching. What no one saw were the bloody crescents carved into the lid from fingernails broken to the quick. For hours, Reverend Josiah Tramble lay in the suffocating dark, mind awake, lungs starving, prayers turning to screams that never reached heaven. And in that grave he discovered what Solomon had always known, that faith means nothing when your God is silence, when the ground itself becomes your final pulpit. By dawn, the Reverend was still. But the silence that followed was not peace, it was the collapse of certainty. The congregation, once enthralled by his booming voice, now whispered of his sudden weakness, his strange end, his cracked sermons. Some said the devil had claimed him, others whispered that God had abandoned him, but the truth was written only in Solomon's journal. The Reverend has been buried with his faith, and faith does not scratch through wood. One name was crossed off the ledger, 8 remained. Charleston awoke to a trembling unease. One man buried alive could be dismissed as accident, as the fickle cruelty of illness, but the Reverend's death was not like the others. It lingered in whispers, bled into gossip over tea, coiled itself into sermons given by lesser men now scrambling to fill the void. His congregation had not forgotten the sweat on his brow, the cracks in his voice, the paranoia in his eyes. To them his burial was not holy, it was haunted, and Solomon fed that fear. He became invisible in plain sight, the shadow behind the doctor's desk, the quiet hands preparing medicines. To the wealthy, he was still the helpful Negro, a servant of science, a harmless figure. But in his journal, he no longer described himself as healer, he called himself architect. For he was no longer just killing men, he was killing illusions. His next move was not immediate murder, but manipulation. Solomon understood that terror spreads faster than poison. At dinner parties in candlelit parlors, he let slip subtle phrases while serving drinks. Strange how the Reverend's eyes stayed open, even in death. Or, some say he scratched at the coffin lid before the soil covered him. He spoke softly, as though confiding rumors he should not share, planting seeds in the minds of Charleston's finest families. Those seeds took root. Soon the city's elite began glancing at one another differently. Who had truly died of fever? Who had collapsed so suddenly at the market? Who among them would be next? Fear became the currency of Charleston's drawing rooms. Wealth could not buy immunity from a force that struck without warning, from a curse that seemed to breathe inside their very blood. Meanwhile, Solomon worked quietly, blending medicine with toxin, prayer with curse. He crafted each death not just as punishment, but as performance. A man would collapse mid-supper, his fork frozen, inches from his lips. Another would falter in bed, eyes wide open as his body locked in place, staring forever at the ceiling. Always the same ending. A coffin sealed too quickly, nails hammered into wood, and silence broken only by scratching below the earth. The city began to murmur of something darker than disease. They spoke of a judgment, a curse upon men who trafficked in flesh. Some whispered that the spirits of the enslaved were rising. Others wondered if the devil himself had walked into Charleston. But Solomon knew the truth. Fear was his weapon, more potent than any toxin, and now the city was drowning in it. Each name he crossed from the ledger was not merely vengeance, it was theater. And the audience, Charleston's most powerful men, were beginning to realize they too were actors in a play where the ending was already written in the dark. The second target was not chosen by chance. His name was Colonel Silas Pembroke, a rice baron whose wealth was carved from the mud and blood of the Carolina swamps. Unlike the Reverend, Pembroke had no sermons to hide behind. His god was profit, his pulpit the auction block, and it was his hand, fat, jeweled, reeking of tobacco, that had lifted the ledger to purchase Marcus, Solomon's eldest son. Solomon never forgot the moment. Marcus trembling in his small shoes, his eyes wide as he was torn from his father's arms. Pembroke's laugh had echoed in Solomon's ears that day, a low grunt of satisfaction as if he were buying livestock, not a child. For years afterwards, Solomon could still hear it in his sleep. Now the laugh would be silenced. Pembroke was known for his appetite, both for food and for women. He consumed as if the world itself were his plate, and no one dared deny him another serving. His body showed the toll, bloated face, veins like ropes pressing against swollen skin. He was a man already drunk on excess, and Solomon knew gluttony was his weakness. It began at supper. Pembroke had been invited to dine at Dr. Hathaway's home, a gathering of Charleston's finest. Solomon moved silently, pouring wine, carrying platters, eyes lowered as though invisible. But with each dish, he prepared the colonel's downfall. A sauce laced with a measured tincture, a goblet of claret stirred just enough to dissolve the clear drops of paralysis. The poison was patient, like Solomon himself. The colonel laughed and stuffed his mouth with roasted duck, red wine dribbling down his chin. He grew louder, redder, the room turning toward him as his words slurred. At first the guests chuckled, but then the laughter died. Pembroke's fork clattered to his plate. His hand froze mid-air, rigid. His eyes bulged wide, his tongue heavy, trapped behind teeth that could no longer form words. Guard. SPS filled the room as the colonel collapsed, body trembling but unresponsive. Dr. Hathaway rushed to his side, muttering about apoplexy, assuring the guests that death comes swiftly to men of his indulgence. Pembroke's face twisted in silent panic, but his body betrayed him, every muscle locked by Solomon's invisible hand. By morning, he was declared dead. Within hours, the undertakers nailed the coffin. No one questioned the speed. Death came often and cruelly in Charleston, and yet beneath the soil, Silas Pembroke was still alive. Inside the box, his swollen body thrashed, his nails gouging wood. In the choking dark, he would remember the cries of children he had bought, the families he had shattered, the son he had stolen from Solomon. Now he was the one screaming unheard, begging for mercy that would not come. Above the earth, Charleston's elite gathered for his burial, their faces pale, their eyes shifting nervously. Another man of prominence gone, another coffin lowered too quickly. Another whisper of something more than fate. In his journal that night, Solomon wrote only one line. Marcus, he will never touch another child again. 2 names were gone from the ledger. 7 remained. By the time Colonel Silas Pembroke's coffin was lowered into the damp earth, Charleston's elite had begun to whisper in earnest. 2 men of stature, gone within months. One a reverend, the other a planter of legendary wealth. Both fallen not to duels or scandal, but to sudden, inexplicable deaths. And in both cases the city moved quickly to bury bodies before questions could spread like fire, but questions did spread. Not among the poor, not among the enslaved, who already believed spirits walked in the soil, but among the men who thought themselves untouchable. For the first time, Charleston's power brokers looked at one another and saw mortality reflected back. Behind the whitewashed columns of Meeting Street, secret gatherings took place. Doors bolted, curtains drawn, cigars burning low as men leaned close across heavy mahogany tables. They spoke of curses, of poison, of whispers carried on the night air. They debated whether the deaths were divine punishment for sins they would never confess in daylight. And though no man dared admit it aloud, each wondered if his own name was marked by unseen hands. It was there, in those private councils, that the first idea of protection took root. Some advocated more doctors, constant examinations, stronger medicines. Others demanded armed guards at their homes, convinced a saboteur stalked the city at night. And a few, the most desperate, suggested blood sacrifices, rituals borrowed from whispers of the islands, offerings meant to turn the wrath of spirits away from Charleston's great men. What none of them understood was that their meetings, their paranoia, their whispered alliances were already part of Solomon's design. He was the shadow in the room, silent as he poured their wine, the quiet servant clearing their plates as they discussed their fears, the man whose eyes they never noticed as they boasted of control, while the piensoeder ledger of their names lay hidden just streets away. Each alliance they formed only bound them tighter in his snare. For Solomon knew the truth of fear. It does not unite, it corrodes. Suspicion bloomed between them like mold on old wood. Who was next? Who had enemies enough to summon a curse? Was it the man across the table with his smile too thin, his gaze too steady? And so Charleston's ruling class began to turn inward, protecting themselves from one another while never realizing the true predator was already seated at their table, listening, waiting, writing their doom in ink that would not fade. That night, Solomon's journal bore no new name crossed off, only a single observation. Fear is the first coffin. They are already burying themselves. Her name returned to him each night like a blade across the heart. Grace, his youngest, only 4 years old when she was sold at the Charleston market. Too small for the fields, too innocent for the swamp. They said she had been purchased by a Savannah family to be raised in the house, trained to serve in silence. But Solomon knew what awaited her. He had seen the lingering touches of masters who looked at girls not as children, but as future possessions of flesh. Grace's cries that morning at the market had never left his ears, and the man who placed the winning bid was Judge Nathaniel Crane, a pillar of Charleston society, a man who wore powdered wigs and black robes, who handed down sentences with lips that spoke of law while his eyes glittered with appetite. To the city, Crane was order incarnate, a symbol of dignity. To Solomon, he was a thief of innocence, a butcher of childhood. Crane's body betrayed him even more than his soul. A man of indulgence, he suffered from trembling hands and failing eyesight. He relied on a bitter draught to steady his nerves before court, one that Dr. Hathaway prepared, never knowing what his assistant slipped into its amber depths. Solomon began his work there. At first, Crane complained only of nausea, of a sour taste he could not name. He scolded Hathaway, demanded a stronger brew. Solomon obliged. Each week, the draft grew more corrupt, laced with toxins that blurred the judge's vision, slowed his speech, bent his once proud gait into something uncertain. To the city, it looked like age. To Solomon, it was the unraveling of a mask. But Solomon did not want Crane to simply die. No, he wanted him to feel the terror of judgment, to know what it meant to be weighed and found wanting. And so, one night as Crane collapsed mid-argument in his courtroom, his body rigid, eyes frozen, Solomon ensured the rumor spread. A judge struck down while condemning another. A man of law silenced while pronouncing guilt. The undertakers sealed him swiftly, as always. But beneath the earth, the judge lived still, scratching, suffocating, gasping in a coffin as dark as the verdicts he had delivered. There was no law there, no gavel, no salvation, only dirt pressing down, and silence louder than his final scream. In his journal, Solomon wrote with cold precision, "Grace, the law that stole you has been buried. The robe means nothing in the grave. 3 names now crossed. 6 remained. And with each burial, Charleston's foundation cracked louder, as though the city itself was being judged by hands that wrote in the dark. By the spring of 1853, Charleston was no longer the proud jewel of the South. It was a city with shadows at every corner. The streets bustled as always. The carriages rolled past the whitewashed mansions. The market cried out with the barter of goods and flesh. But beneath it all, a sickness had taken root. Fear had become the language of Charleston's elite, and Solomon was the author of every whispered phrase. 3 men of standing had died, each under circumstances too similar to ignore. Reverend Tramble, the voice of God, gone. Colonel Pembroke, the bloated planter, gone. Judge Crane, the gavel of law, gone. And all buried too swiftly, their coffins sealed before suspicion could rise above a whisper. But the whispers spread nonetheless, slithering from parlor to parlor, from church pews to courthouse steps. It was Solomon who fed them, unseen. Servants carried stories he planted, coffins scratched from within, faces twisted in unnatural terror, faint sounds heard at midnight in the cemetery. No one could prove the tales, yet they grew like ivy over stone, impossible to tear away once rooted. Soon families began refusing to dine together for fear of being poisoned. Some demanded their food be tasted by slaves before they lifted a spoon. Others clutched rosaries, muttering prayers as though every breath might be their last. And still, the city pretended. Balls were held, music echoed from candlelit halls. But the laughter was forced, brittle, cracking under the weight of invisible dread. The wealthiest men now drank their wine with suspicion, glancing sideways at one another, wondering who among them might be marked for the grave. Even the physicians whispered of a plague, a malady of the elite that spared no man regardless of rank or wealth. But Solomon's hand reached beyond rumor. He began to orchestrate moments of dread. He left subtle tokens in the houses of his intended victims, scratches on door frames, a dead bird on a windowsill, bottles of medicine mysteriously overturned. Nothing direct, nothing that could be traced. Just enough to make a man wake at night, heart pounding, convinced that eyes watched him from the darkness. Charleston was no longer merely afraid of death. It was afraid of burial, of waking in the dark with lungs screaming and no one to hear. A city of masters had become a city of prisoners, locked in their own minds, scratching at their thoughts like wood above a coffin lid. In his journal, Solomon wrote, "The city breathes shallow now. They are all beneath the soil already, only waiting for me to close the earth above them." If Reverend Tramble was the voice, Colonel Pembroke the muscle, and Judge Crane the law, then Charleston's true heart was money, and the man who held its pulse was Augustus Harridan, a banker whose fortune flowed like a poisoned river through every slave auction and plantation ledger. He never owned the whip himself, but his coin bought thousands of lashes. He was the invisible master, the hand that chained men without ever touching iron. It was Harridan who signed the credit slips that tore grace from Solomon. It was Harridan who financed Pembroke's rice empire and Crane's courthouse expansions. To Charleston, he was respectable, a man of polished shoes, immaculate waistcoats, and a ledger that never lied. But to Solomon, he was wrought in silk. This time, vengeance would not come swiftly. Harridan's power was built on the illusion of permanence, on numbers written in neat black ink. Solomon decided he would not merely take the banker's life, he would bury the very idea of his wealth. It began with whispers among the slaves in Harridan's household, planted by Solomon's careful hand. Food gone missing, coins vanishing from his desk, strange shadows in the hallways at night. Soon, Harridan grew suspicious of his own servants. He docked their rations, ordered whippings, dismissed long-trusted hands. But the incidents only grew worse, each one orchestrated by Solomon's unseen design. The house became a theater of paranoia, and Harridan, its shrieking actor. Then came the money. One evening, Harridan returned from his counting house to find his ledger smeared, pages damp with spilled ink. Inside, a line written in Solomon's careful hand: "You cannot count what cannot breathe." The banker's face drained pale. He ordered the pages burned, swore his clerks to silence. But he could not burn the dread that had already taken root. Finally, at a dinner hosted by Hathaway, Harridan's doom arrived. He lifted his glass of brandy, amber fire flickering in candlelight, and within moments his words faltered. His lips quivered, his throat tightened. Guests leapt to their feet as the banker clawed at his neck, his eyes bulging like a man strangled by invisible hands. He fell to the floor, gasping like a fish dragged onto land, his fingers scrabbling at the wood. By dawn, his body lay in a coffin, his fortune locked in vaults he would never touch again. But Solomon knew that Harridan's torment was not over. Beneath the earth, the paralysis would fade, leaving him conscious, pressed under soil, trapped with only the silence of numbers that could not save him. That night, Solomon wrote in his journal, "Gold cannot fill a coffin. Ink cannot loosen the soil. The banker counts no more. 4 names were gone. 5 remained. And with Harridan's death, Charleston learned a terrible truth. Not even money could buy mercy from the grave." By the time Augustus Harridan's coffin was nailed shut, Charleston was no longer a city of confidence. It was a city trembling on its own foundations. 4 pillars of power had fallen: the pulpit, the plantation, the court, and now the banker's vault. The city's elite gathered in parlors with curtains drawn, sweating beneath chandeliers that once glittered with pride, but now swung like nooses overhead. Fear made them reckless. Every dinner was a gamble, every sip of wine a wager. Silver spoons paused halfway to lips, eyes darted across tables. Wives whispered of strange dreams, of shadows at the foot of their beds. Husbands clutched pistols in the dark, convinced that death crept through their keyholes. And then came the accusations. Colonel Whitford accused Senator Ashe of hiring a poisoner to gain influence. Senator Ashe accused Whitford of the same. Families who had shared pews in church for generations now spat venom across city streets. Old alliances cracked like dry timber, merchants against planters, planters against politicians, politicians against the very doctors sworn to protect them. Even Hathaway, once trusted, now found suspicious eyes fixed on his practice. How strange, they whispered, that death always seemed to pass through the hands of his assistant, but Solomon was already weaving this chaos into his design. He let certain rumors fall where they would do the most damage. A misplaced vial here, a cryptic phrase spoken softly as he served tea. "Not all poisons are swallowed," he murmured once within earshot of a senator's wife. "Some are whispered." That single sentence spread like fever, turning every word spoken in Charleston into a potential dagger. By summer, the city's great men had become prisoners in their own homes. They refused to dine together. They hired guards for their bedrooms. They demanded their servants taste every plate of food. Yet I won their paranoia. They also turned against the very enslaved people who clothed them, fed them, carried their secrets. Suspicion became cruelty. Cruelty became chaos, and chaos made Solomon's work easier than any poison, for the truth was simple. Charleston no longer needed Solomon to kill it. It was killing itself. He had planted the seed, and now the roots split the city's marble columns from within. That night in his journal, Solomon wrote, They are digging their own graves with their tongues. I need only wait to cover them with soil. The fifth name on Solomon's ledger was not merely a man, it was an empire of sails and saltwater. Edward Grimble, Charleston's shipping magnate, the master of the harbour. His ships carried rice and indigo to Europe, but their decks were stained by a darker cargo. For decades, even after the trade was outlawed, Grimble's vessels had whispered across the Atlantic under foreign flags, packed with stolen men, women, and children. He was not just a profiteer, he was a trafficker, a merchant of souls. Solomon remembered watching from the dockyards as chained Africans, skeletal and sunburnt, staggered from Grimble's ships. He remembered the cries, the language he could not understand, the stink of blood and seawater mingling into something that clung to Charleston's air for days. Grimble had overseen it all with a cigar clamped in his teeth, counting profits while human beings collapsed on the planks beneath him. This death would not come in silence. Solomon decided Grimble must drown in the fear he had given to others. He began by haunting the docks. Sailors swore they heard voices at night, strange songs on the wind. A crate was found smashed open, its contents scattered, though no thief had touched it. Once a ledger appeared soaked in seawater, though it had never left Grimble's desk. The whispers spread. The ocean was calling for repayment. Grimble, a man who laughed at superstition, grew restless. He began avoiding the harbour after dusk. His nights became sleepless, plagued by dreams of black waves crashing against his coffin, of chains dragging him beneath the tide. When he woke, his bedclothes were damp with sweat, his body shivering, though the night was warm. Solomon struck when Grimble felt safest, at a banquet celebrating the expansion of his fleet. The magnate raised a goblet, boasting of new trade routes, his laughter booming across the hall, the wine, laced with Solomon's tincture, slid down his throat like a tide turning against him. Minutes later, his chest seized, his mouth gaped, his lungs fought as though drowning on air. Guests screamed as Grimble clawed at his throat, waterless yet gasping as though the sea itself had filled his lungs. By dawn, he was sealed in a coffin, lowered not into the earth, but into the damp ground near the harbour, close enough to hear the creak of ships as they swayed in the tide. Inside the box, as breath returned but air did not, Grimble learned the fate of his captives, to suffocate in the dark, to die unnamed beneath the weight of boards, to hear the ocean singing, but never escape it. That night, Solomon's journal bore his coldest entry yet. The sea has taken him back. For every soul he drowns 1,000 times more. 5 names now gone, 4 remained. Charleston's harbour fell silent after Grimble's death. Ships sat idle, captains refused to sail, and merchants whispered that the ocean itself had turned against them. Commerce faltered. The city's veins were closing. By the time Grimble's body stiffened beneath the harbour soil, the quiet illusion of coincidence had collapsed. Charleston's elite could no longer pretend that 9 deaths scattered across years were accidents of fate or judgments of nature, or mysteries to be buried with polite silence. The city's gossip had mutated into dread. The powerful whispered behind locked doors. Someone was hunting them. The Charleston Courier tried to contain it with editorials about unfortunate illnesses, but the truth was leaking through the cracks. Coffins scratched from within, eyes frozen in terror, bodies twisted as if struggling against invisible chains. Word spread like wildfire through taverns and kitchens, through slave quarters and alleyways. The people knew. And once the people knew, control was no longer possible. Solomon, in his silence, watched panic bloom among the men who once walked with untouchable arrogance. Invitations to dinner dwindled. The great mansions that once roared with parties now closed their shutters after dusk. Planters stopped attending their plantations, afraid to travel alone. Physicians began double-checking every tincture, every glass of wine, even as they trembled, because they suspected but dared not speak what they already knew. The masters were being hunted by one of their own servants. Meetings were called behind church doors, not for prayer, but for strategy. The elders of Charleston's ruling class demanded explanations. They spoke of poisons, of secret societies, of curses carried from Africa. Some whispered of rebellion, that the slaves were rising in silence, striking down their masters one by one. Others blamed God, insisting that judgment had finally come to the south. And in the shadows of those meetings, Solomon sat unseen, attending to his master's duties, pouring water, carrying notes, pretending to be invisible. Yet every word spoken was his reward. The men were devouring themselves with fear, searching for an enemy among shadows, while the real executioner refilled their cups. What unsettled them most was not the deaths themselves, but the method. Each body bore the same marks: fingernails broken, wood splintered, faces frozen mid-scream. These were not ordinary deaths, they were messages. Whoever orchestrated this wanted them to know terror, wanted them to feel, in their final moments, what it meant to be powerless. By now, wives refused to sleep beside their husbands, fearing they might be next. Sons abandoned their fathers, unwilling to inherit a curse. Entire families packed up and fled northward, selling their estates at half their value. Charleston's wealth began to rot from within, eaten alive by the paranoia of its rulers, and still 9 names remained in Solomon's book. With each death, the city's control systems faltered. The masks of civilization slipped. The truth was revealing itself, that Charleston was not a city of order and grace, but a gilded cage built on blood. And now that blood had come to collect, it was no longer revenge. It was revelation. Charleston, once draped in the polished pride of the antebellum South, now pulsed with unease like a fevered body. Fear had become the city's dominant currency. Doors that once stood wide for guests were barred with iron bolts. Candles burned all night in halls that had never known shadows. The city that enslaved thousands now lived enslaved itself, captive to an invisible hand tightening around its throat. And that hand belonged to Solomon. For years, he had worn the mask of servant, healer, invisible shadow. But now the mask was no longer necessary. His true power wasn't in the toxins he brewed or the calculated burials he orchestrated. His true power was in control of perception. He didn't need to kill every man who deserved it. He only needed the city to believe he could. Fear would finish the work his hands could not. The ruling families began to turn on each other. At dinners, those few still held, men accused their peers of harboring secret enemies. Brothers denounced brothers. Partners dissolved businesses in paranoia, each suspecting betrayal. The web of alliances that held Charleston's aristocracy together unraveled strand by strand. Solomon's revenge had moved beyond blood. It was dismantling the entire architecture of power. Even the church, the holy shield of slavery's moral justification, faltered. Ministers stammered through sermons about divine punishment. Some whispered that Charleston was cursed, that the ground itself rejected the blood it had been fed. Slaves who once bowed silently in pews now lifted their heads, their eyes unafraid, because they saw what the masters refused to speak aloud. The power had shifted, and Solomon fed that power with precision. He spread rumors through whispered conversations in kitchens, through carefully placed words to servants who carried gossip like fire. He allowed certain clues to accidentally appear. Scraps of journal pages, strange mixtures left half hidden. Each fragment stoked the belief in something larger, something unstoppable. He was no longer a man. He was becoming a legend, but legends are dangerous to their makers. The more Charleston believed in him, the closer suspicion circled his shadow. He knew the ruling families had begun to suspect the deaths were linked to medicine, to compounds only a few men could prepare. He knew whispers had even brushed against Dr. Hathaway's name, and by extension his own. Yet Solomon didn't flinch. He wanted their suspicion. He wanted them to know terror had a face. For too long his people had been faceless, numbers in ledgers, names erased at the auction block. But now, each coffin told Charleston a story it could never erase. Every death was a mirror held to the city, and the reflection showed only rot. The 6th name in Solomon's ledger was not simply a man, it was Charleston's most untouchable symbol. Judge Alistair Pembroke, robed in black, crowned in authority, the iron gavel of the city's law. For 30 years, Pembroke had stood at the apex of Charleston's hierarchy, handing down rulings that shattered lives, tearing families apart with a flick of his wrist, and sanctifying the violence of slavery beneath the false majesty of legal scripture. He was not a killer by his own hands, yet his sentences were executions carried out by others. He had declared men and women property, with the same tone used to weigh livestock. He had signed off on auctions that scattered families into oblivion, and in 1851 it was Pembroke who notarized the sale that ripped Solomon's children from his arms. His signature, elegant and precise, was the final blade that severed Solomon's world. For that, Solomon reserved a special death. He began by haunting Pembroke's mind. Strange documents appeared in the judge's chambers, pages from case files that should not exist, testimonies written in the handwriting of slaves long dead. His desk was found one morning dusted in white ash, as though parchment had burned upon it during the night. Then came the whispers, disembodied voices in the courthouse halls, echoing like the testimonies of the damned. Clerks fled their posts, refusing to work late. The courthouse, once the very temple of law, became a mausoleum of fear. Pembroke clung to his dignity. He carried his gavel like a weapon, barking judgments with greater ferocity, as if louder rulings could drown out the sound of his own unraveling. But his body betrayed him. He woke one morning with his hands trembling, unable to grip his pen. His voice faltered mid-sentence in court. Doctors were summoned, and Solomon, careful as ever, was called to assist. The irony was delicious. The judge's very survival depended on the man he had condemned to invisibility. The toxin worked swiftly this time. Pembroke collapsed during a trial, his words cut short, his body stiffening as though struck by a divine hand. The court erupted in chaos. Lawyers screamed, clerks rushed forward, wives fainted in the gallery. Pembroke's body was declared lifeless, and the gavel he once wielded as an instrument of power fell from his hand to the floor, splitting the silence like thunder. But his death was no silent drift into darkness. In his coffin, buried with the dignity of his station, Pembroke clawed until his nails split. His gavel, placed ceremoniously upon his chest, was later found broken, its wood splintered by his own desperate hands as he thrashed against the lid. Solomon's journal captured the moment with brutal precision. The law that bound us is buried with him. His gavel broke where his justice never bent. Let the city learn, their courts cannot protect them. When word spread, Charleston trembled, not because another man had fallen, but because the law itself had been humiliated. Judges, once worshipped as gods in black robes, now hid behind armed escorts. No ruling could erase the truth. The law had been judged and found wanting. 6 were gone. 3 remained, and the city itself was beginning to look like the coffin Solomon was building around it. The 7th man on Solomon's list was not a planter, nor a trader, nor a judge. He was something far more insidious. A priest. Reverend Josiah Blackthorne, pastor of St. Michael's, the grand church whose bells tolled over Charleston's cobblestone streets. His sermons, thunderous and dripping with sanctimony, were the hymns that baptized slavery in the name of God. For years, Reverend Blackthorne's voice had been the velvet blade of Charleston's conscience. He quoted scripture to sanctify chains, twisting holy words into shackles. He preached obedience as salvation, convincing the enslaved that submission was divine duty, while telling the masters that cruelty was God's order. And from the pulpit, he did more than bless. It was he who publicly justified the separation of Solomon's family, declaring it the will of Providence. Blackthorne was not just another man to be buried. He was the very mouthpiece of power. To silence him would mean cutting out the voice that had sung Charleston's lies into eternity. Solomon began by haunting the reverend in his own temple. Candles snuffed themselves during evening prayers. A Bible left open on the pulpit was found with entire passages blackened by ash, as if the fire had come from the pages themselves. The communion chalice, polished every week, one morning bore dark stains resembling blood. Parishioners whispered that the church was cursed, that God had withdrawn from its walls. Attendance dwindled. Fear of blasphemy spread. Blackthorne fought the whispers with louder sermons, sweating beneath the high rafters as his booming voice cracked. He pounded his fists upon the pulpit, declaring Satan himself walked among them. But Solomon was no demon. He was something worse, a man who had learned to weaponize truth. On a rain-soaked Sunday morning, Reverend Blackthorne lifted the communion chalice before his dwindling congregation. His lay IPS touched the wine, Solomon's wine. The toxin surged through him, paralyzing first his tongue, then his hands, then his chest. Before his horrified congregation, the priest collapsed at the very altar he had once used as a throne of false righteousness. His robes, heavy with gold trim, dragged across the stone floor as acolytes rushed forward. His eyes fluttered, his body slackened. The faithful gasped, whispering of divine punishment. Burial was swift, a hurried ceremony under storm clouds. Blackthorne's coffin was lowered into consecrated ground, but holiness could not protect him. Beneath the earth, paralyzed and conscious, the Reverend tried to pray, but no sound came. His throat locked, his tongue stiff, his words sealed within him. For the first time, the man who had spoken endlessly of God's will was struck mute, entombed in silence. Solomon's journal entry for that night was carved into the page with shaking fury. The voice of their God has been buried. Let them kneel now, not to heaven, but to the graves they dug for us. When news spread, Charleston quaked. The death of a priest could not be explained as illness or coincidence. For the first time, the city whispered aloud what it had always feared. This was judgment, not of God, but of man. 7 were gone. 2 remained, and Charleston's altar had been toppled in blood and silence. The ledger was nearly complete. 7 names crossed out in ink and soil. 7 men gasping their last in darkness. Only 2 remained, the final pillars of Charleston's empire, the last stones holding up a crumbling order. The first was Edmund Piton, the planter whose debts had triggered Solomon's nightmare, the man who had sold his wife and children like livestock, the man who laughed when Solomon begged for mercy. If the others were symbols, Piton was the source, the poison root from which Solomon's suffering had grown. His death could not be simple, it had to be eternal. For weeks, Solomon stalked him in silence. Piton drank heavily now, his fortune drained, his estate collapsing under whispers of curses. He dismissed servants in fear they might turn on him, yet he was too weak to live alone. His arrogance had rotted into paranoia, and Solomon ensured it deepened. Strange symbols appeared on Piton's doors, painted in ash. His food spoiled within hours of being cooked. At night, a woman's voice, Celia's voice, was heard singing outside his window, though no one was there. Piton, once a tyrant, now cowered in his own house, a prisoner of his own guilt. The end came during a drunken evening when Piton stumbled into his parlor, clutching a goblet Solomon had left prepared. He drained it greedily, desperate for numbness. The toxin struck fast. Piton's legs failed, his breath seized, his eyes wide with the recognition of what was happening. Solomon stood in the doorway, watching, not as a servant now, but as the last face Piton would ever see. When the coffin lid closed, Solomon whispered through the wood, "You buried my family in chains. Now you bury yourself in silence." And with that, the circle of vengeance neared its end. The final name belonged not to a single man, but to Charleston itself, because the city was the true master, the system, the machine that crushed lives, and called it civilization. The 9 men were only its bones, but Solomon's campaign of terror had spread beyond them. Fear now ruled every street, every household, every pulpit. Commerce faltered, law trembled, the church collapsed, families fled. Charleston's wealth drained away like blood from a wound. Solomon's final journal entry was not written in words, but in silence. The last pages were blank, as if he had understood. His vengeance was no longer his own. It belonged to history. It belonged to every nameless soul who had ever been chained, bought, or buried. His silence was an invitation for others to write the next chapter. When, decades later, workers uncovered those 9 coffins, they found the story etched not only in wood, but in the collective memory of a city that had tried to bury the truth. The fingernail scratches were not just marks of desperation, they were records of resistance. proof that power is never absolute, that the buried do not always rest, that silence itself can rise as the loudest rebellion. And as you sit here listening, you must ask yourself, was Solomon ever truly finished? Or does his spirit still stalk the halls of power, reminding those who exploit and enslave that their coffins are already waiting? Comment these words below to seal your place among those who see through the lies. The buried still speak. And remember, Charleston tried to erase Solomon Fairfax, but legends do not die. Legends dig. Legends claw. Legends wait for the earth to shift. 9 men went into the ground screaming, and through them, an entire empire of cruelty began to rot. The ledger is closed, but the warning remains.